The laughter echoed through the observation deck of the Galactic Coalition station. Commander Daniel Hayes stood near the viewport, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the alien delegates point at the human fleet anchored in the distance. The sound of their mockery was something he had learned to expect, but it still burned in his chest like a small fire that refused to die. The ambassador was the loudest. His name was, and his body was made of living crystal that shifted colors with his emotions. Right now, those crystals glowed with bright purple amusement. He made clicking sounds with his faceted mouth, and the translation device in Daniel's ear turned them into words. "These are your warships?" asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "These ancient things. I have seen museum pieces that looked newer than this collection of rust and memories." The other alien delegates joined in the laughter. The representative, a being that looked like a floating cloud of silver mist, rippled with amusement. The admiral, whose 4 arms were covered in ceremonial armor, shook his head slowly as if witnessing something too sad to believe. Daniel said nothing. He simply looked at his ships. The human fleet was old. There was no denying that truth. The flagship was the USS Defiance, a vessel built during the first expansion era more than 200 years ago. Her hull was covered in scars from battles that most people had forgotten. The paint had faded from proud blue to a dull gray that spoke of decades spent in storage. Beside her floated the USS Resolute and the USS Constitution, ships of the same era, equally worn and equally dismissed. These vessels had been pulled from mothball reserves on Mars and Europa. When humanity joined the Galactic Coalition and was required to contribute military assets to the shared defense force, these were the ships that had been offered. The alien admirals had nearly refused to accept them. Lieutenant Commander Lisa walked up to stand beside Daniel. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, but Daniel had served with her long enough to know the strength that lived beneath her calm surface. "They do not understand," Lisa said softly, looking at the ships through the viewport. "They see old metal and faded paint. They do not see what those ships have survived." "No," Daniel agreed, "they do not." Admiral Karen had been the one to insist that the coalition accept the human contribution. She was the oldest serving officer in the human navy, a woman whose family had served on warships for 6 generations. When the alien admirals had laughed at the fleet she presented, she had simply stood there with her hands folded and waited for them to finish. "These ships earned their place in history," Karen had said. "They will earn it again. You may laugh now. I promise you will not laugh forever." The aliens had accepted the ships only because refusing would have been a diplomatic incident. They assigned the human fleet to the outer edge of the defensive formation, far from any position of importance. It was a placement designed to keep the embarrassing relics out of sight. Now Daniel watched those relics drift in formation, their running lights dim, their engines cold. Around them, the alien fleets formed a wall of magnificence that made the human ships look even smaller by comparison. The dreadnoughts were built from crystals that sang with captured starlight. The carriers seemed to flow like living silver, their hulls shifting and changing shape with every passing moment. The battle cruisers were monuments of gleaming armor, each one large enough to hold a small city within its frame. Against such ships, the human fleet looked like ancient beasts standing beside creatures of pure light. Moved closer to Daniel, his crystal body catching the light from the viewport and scattering it into rainbows across the deck. His voice carried a tone of false sympathy that made Daniel's jaw tighten. "You should understand something," human said. "We have existed as a spacefaring civilization for 12,000 years. We have fought wars against enemies your species cannot imagine. We have built weapons that can destroy stars. And in all that time, we have never seen anything as sad as the collection of scrap metal you call a fleet." Daniel turned to look at the ambassador. His face showed nothing, but his eyes were steady and hard. "Our ships may be old," Daniel said, "but they are still here. They have been through battles that should have destroyed them. They have carried crews through impossible situations. They have been broken and rebuilt and broken again, and every time they came back, made a sound that might have been a snort. Coming back from the scrapyard does not make them warriors. It makes them stubborn machines that do not know when to stop. Perhaps, Daniel said, but stubborn machines have won a lot of battles. The ambassador waved one crystalline hand in dismissal. The Void Collective is massing at the edge of this sector. When they attack, your relics will be the first to fall. Their weapons are designed to disable the most advanced technology in the galaxy. What chance do your primitive vessels have against that? Daniel did not answer. He turned back to the viewport and looked at the USS Defiance floating in the darkness. He thought about the stories his grandfather had told him, stories about the Battle of New Helsinki and the blockade and the long, desperate night at station. Those stories were not about advanced technology or superior weapons. They were about people who refused to give up. Lisa stood beside him in silence. She understood what he was feeling because she felt it too. Every human who served in the fleet knew the history of those old ships. They knew the names of the crews who had lived and died aboard them. They knew that the rust and the scars and the faded paint covered something that the aliens could not see. The alien delegates eventually grew bored with their mockery and drifted away to other conversations. The observation deck became quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the station and the distant light of stars. Daniel remained at the viewport for a long time. He watched his ships and remembered the words Admiral had spoken when she gave him his orders. "The Coalition thinks we are a joke," Karen had said. "They think our ships are relics and our people are primitives playing at being soldiers. Let them think that. When the time comes, we will show them what humanity is made of." Daniel had asked her how she could be so certain. Karen had smiled, and for a moment she had looked like the young officer who had served on the Defiance 50 years ago. "Because those ships are still here," she had said. "Because we are still here, and because no one has ever beaten humanity by underestimating us." The stars outside the viewport burned cold and distant. Somewhere beyond them, the Void Collective was gathering its forces. Somewhere beyond them, a war was coming. Daniel Hayes looked at his ancient fleet and made a silent promise. When that war arrived, the laughter would stop. Deep within the USS Defiance, Chief Engineer Park walked through corridors that held more history than most museums. His boots made soft sounds against metal floors that had been walked by thousands of crew members over 2 centuries. The walls around him were cold to the touch, covered in tiny dents and scratches from 100 battles that the galaxy had forgotten. Stopped near a section of wall where someone had scratched a message into the paint long ago. The words were simple: "She brought us home." He did not know who had written those words or when, but he understood them perfectly. "She has been sleeping for 40 years, said to the young engineers following behind him. "But she remembers how to fight. Never forget that." The Defiance had been built in an era when humanity was just beginning to explore the stars. Her designers had not known what dangers waited in the darkness, so they had built her to survive anything. Her hull was thick and heavy, made from layers of steel and titanium that no modern ship would use. Her reactors were fusion cores that ran on principles so old that most species had abandoned them centuries ago. Her weapons were, and missile tubes, kinetic systems that threw metal at incredible speeds rather than firing beams of energy. By the standards of the Galactic Coalition, the Defiance was a dinosaur, but dinosaurs had ruled the Earth for millions of years. Captain Torres called a meeting of his senior staff in the wardroom. The room was small compared to the elegant conference chambers on the alien vessels. The table was made of actual wood, dark, and from generations of use. It was a tradition that dated back to the naval vessels that sailed Earth's oceans, a reminder of where humanity had come from. Stood at the head of the table. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He had served on the Defiance for 15 years, first as a lieutenant, then as executive officer, and finally as captain. He knew every corner of the ship, every sound her engines made, every tremor in her hull. Coalition intelligence has sent us new information, began. The Void Collective is massing at the edge of the sector. Current estimates put their fleet at 300 warships, possibly more. The officers around the table exchanged worried glances. Lieutenant Amy, the tactical officer, pulled up a display showing the enemy fleet's last known position. The red dots representing collective vessels seemed to multiply as the data updated. 300 ships is larger than anything the Coalition has faced in decades, Amy said. But our combined forces outnumber them. We should be able to hold the line. Shook his head slowly. Numbers do not mean everything. The collective has new weapons. Our intelligence reports talk about something called phase disruptors. Explain, said. Leaned forward, his hands flat on the wooden table. Phase disruptors target quantum entanglement signatures. Every modern power core uses quantum entanglement to generate and distribute energy. The more advanced the technology, the more dependent it is on those systems. One pulse from a phase disruptor can shut down a ship completely. The room fell silent as everyone understood what that meant. The dreadnoughts, the carriers, the battle cruisers, all of them relied on quantum cores. If the collective could disable those systems with a single weapon, the most powerful fleet in the galaxy would become a collection of helpless targets. What about our ships? Asked quietly. A thin smile crossed his face. Captain, our reactors are so old that they are practically analog. We do not use quantum entanglement because that technology did not exist when these ships were built. The phase disruptors would pass through our systems like wind through an open door. Amy stared at him. Are you saying that being primitive might actually save us? I am saying that the Void Collective designed their weapon to fight the future. They never considered that they might have to fight the past. Sat down slowly, his mind working through the implications. The alien fleets had laughed at the human ships for being old and outdated. They had pushed them to the edge of the formation where they would not embarrass anyone. They had treated them like relics that should have been melted down for scrap. And now those relics might be the only ships in the sector that could fight back. This is what Admiral was counting on, said. She knew about the phase disruptors. She knew our ships would be immune. She has been preparing for this moment for years, confirmed. Why do you think she fought so hard to keep these ships in service? Why do you think she insisted on bringing them to the Coalition? She was not being sentimental. She was being strategic. Thought about the USS Resolute, anchored nearby. That ship had held the line at the blockade for 6 days without resupply. Her crew had rationed food and water and ammunition, fighting off wave after wave of enemy attacks until reinforcements finally arrived. They had lost half their people, but they had not lost the blockade. He thought about the USS Constitution, the first human vessel to achieve faster-than-light combat. She had chased down a raider that was attacking colony transports, matching its jumps through fold space, and finally destroying it in a battle that lasted 14 hours. The still told stories about that fight, though they had changed the ending to make themselves look better. He thought about the Defiance herself, about the Battle of New Helsinki where she had broken through enemy lines with her hull burning and her crew wounded and her captain dead at his station. She had taken 17 direct hits that day. 17 holes punched through her armor, 17 moments when she should have died. But she had kept fighting, kept flying, kept carrying her people toward safety. These were not museum pieces. These were survivors. Stood up and looked at his officers. These people had chosen to serve on the oldest ship in the fleet. They had accepted the mockery and the jokes and the pitying looks from their colleagues on newer vessels. They had done it because they believed in something that the aliens could not understand. When the Void Collective attacks, said, the Coalition fleet will lose their power. They will be helpless, and we will be the only ones who can fight. We are 12 ships against 300, Amy pointed out. Even if we can fight, can we actually win? Answered before could speak. The Defiance survived New Helsinki. The Resolute survived. The Constitution survived These ships do not know how to lose. Nodded slowly. Send a message to all human vessels. Tell them to prepare for combat operations. Tell them to check every system, every weapon, every inch of hull plating. When the time comes, we need to be ready. He paused and looked at the wooden table, thinking about all the officers who had sat in this room before him. Tell them that humanity is about to remind the galaxy why our ancestors conquered the stars. The attack came without warning on a day that had seemed like any other. Daniel Hayes was reviewing reports in his quarters when the alarms began to scream. Red lights flashed through the corridors of the Coalition station, and the calm voice of the computer announced that hostile vessels had emerged from fold space at the edge of the sector. He was running toward the command center before the message finished. The Void Collective had arrived. Daniel burst through the doors of the command center and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The main showed the enemy fleet emerging from ripples in space, ship after ship appearing like shadows given solid form. They were black and angular, their hulls absorbing light rather than reflecting it. They moved in perfect formation, 300 vessels spreading across the darkness like a stain. Stood at the tactical display, his crystalline body flickering with colors that Daniel had never seen before. Fear, perhaps, or shock. The ambassador had laughed at the human fleet just days ago. He was not laughing now. All coalition vessels, engage defensive formation, the commander ordered through the communications system. Prepare to repel the enemy. The coalition fleet moved with practiced precision. Dreadnoughts surged forward, their crystal hulls blazing with stored starlight. Carriers released swarms of fighter craft that glittered like silver dust. Battlecruisers powered up weapons that could crack moons in half. It was the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever assembled. And then the Void Collective fired their phase disruptors. The weapons did not look like much. They were pulses of pale blue light that washed across the Coalition fleet like gentle waves. There was no explosion, no fire, no destruction. The pulses simply passed through the alien vessels as if touching them with invisible fingers. The effect was instant and terrible. The dreadnoughts went dark. Their crystal hulls, which had blazed with the light of captured stars, faded to dull gray as their quantum cores failed. The magnificent ships began to drift, spinning slowly in the void, their crews trapped inside vessels that no longer answered any command. The carriers suffered the same fate. Their flowing silver hulls became still and lifeless, their fighter swarms suddenly orphaned as the motherships that guided them fell silent. Thousands of small craft scattered in confusion, their pilots screaming for help that would never come. The battle cruisers, pride of the elder races, became tombs. Their weapons powered down. Their engines died. Their crews, four-armed warriors who had conquered 100 worlds, found themselves helpless in the face of an enemy they could not fight. Daniel watched the disaster unfold on the ship after ship went dark. Thousands of the most advanced vessels in the galaxy reduced to drifting wreckage without a single shot being fired. The Void Collective had not destroyed the Coalition fleet. They had simply turned it off. Made a sound like breaking glass. "Impossible," he whispered. "Our technology is the most advanced in the galaxy. Nothing should be able to do this." "That is exactly the problem," Daniel said quietly. The turned to look at him, confusion and fear mingling in his faceted eyes. "What do you mean?" "Your technology is too advanced. The phase disruptors target quantum entanglement signatures. Every power system in your fleet depends on quantum cores. The more sophisticated your ships are, the more vulnerable they become." The realization spread across crystalline features. Then nothing can stop them, nothing can fight back. Daniel shook his head slowly, Not nothing. He turned to look through the viewport at the edge of the formation, where the human fleet had been positioned so that no one would have to look at them. The 12 ancient vessels still drifted there, their running lights dim, their presence almost forgotten in the chaos. Then something changed. The USS Defiance powered up. Daniel watched as running lights blazed along her hull, cutting through the darkness like beacons of defiance. Her ancient fusion reactors roared to full power for the first time in 40 years, filling the void with the deep thrumming sound that human crews had heard in 100 battles. Her weapons ports opened, revealing rows of and missile tubes that had been waiting patiently for this moment. The USS Resolute followed, her engines burning bright. Then the USS Constitution, then the Valiant, then the Pioneer, then the Independence. One by one, the Relic fleet awakened, their old systems coming online with the reliability of machines that had been built to last forever. The Void Collective turned their phase disruptors on the human vessels. Blue pulses washed across the ancient hulls, touching metal that had been forged 200 years ago. Nothing happened. The human reactors were too primitive to be affected. They did not use quantum entanglement because that technology had not existed when they were built. The disruptors, designed to defeat the most advanced ships in the galaxy, could not find anything to target. Captain Torres stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the enemy fleet through the... His hands were steady on the arms of his command chair, the same chair that had held a dozen captains before him. "Open a channel to all human vessels," he ordered. The communications officer nodded. "Channel open, sir." Took a breath. This was the moment that Admiral had been preparing for, the moment that humanity had been waiting for without even knowing it. The coalition had laughed at them. The enemy had ignored them, and now they were the only ones left standing. "This is Captain Torres to all human vessels," he said, his voice carrying across the darkness to every man and woman who served on the Relic fleet. "The coalition is down. The enemy thinks they have already won. It is time to prove them wrong." He paused, looking at the ancient bridge around him. Every surface showed the wear of 2 centuries, the marks of battles that had been fought and won before any of these crews were born. This ship had carried humanity through its darkest hours. She would do it again. "Our ships are old," continued. "Our weapons are simple. Our technology is something the rest of the galaxy threw away long ago, but we are still here. We are still fighting, and we are going to remind the galaxy why they used to fear the dark." He stood up from his chair and faced where the Void Collective was beginning to move toward the helpless coalition vessels. "All ships form up on the Defiance. Prepare for combat operations." The acknowledgments came back one by one, 12 voices from 12 vessels that had been dismissed and mocked and forgotten. Torres smiled grimly. Time to wake up the relics. USS Defiance led the charge into the heart of the Void Collective fleet. Her fired in steady rhythm, launching slugs of depleted uranium at speeds that turned simple metal into weapons of devastating power. Each shot crossed the darkness in the blink of an eye, punching through enemy shields that had been designed to stop energy beams, not chunks of ancient iron traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. The Void Collective had never faced kinetic weapons. They had evolved beyond such primitive methods centuries ago. They had never bothered to develop defenses against something so simple. It was a mistake that cost them dearly. Captain Torres stood on the bridge, barking orders as his crew worked with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained for this moment their entire lives. The ship shuddered with each salvo, a familiar tremor that ran through the deck plates and reminded everyone aboard that they were fighting, that they were alive, that they were making a difference. "Target the nearest destroyer," ordered. "Full spread missiles and rails." Lieutenant Amy worked the targeting console, her fingers dancing across controls that had been designed in an era before and holographic displays. The old systems required more skill to operate, more knowledge, more instinct. That was fine. Human crews had been mastering these systems for generations. Firing solution locked, Amy reported. Missiles away. 12 missiles streaked from the Defiance's tubes, their exhaust trails painting bright lines across the void. They wove through the chaos of battle, dodging enemy fire with the guidance systems their human programmers had given them. When they struck the collective destroyer, the vessel crumpled inward like a can being crushed by an invisible hand. Allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction before turning his attention to the next target. There were still nearly 300 enemy ships out there, and his fleet numbered only 12. 12 against 300. The mathematics were not in their favor. But mathematics had never stopped humanity before. The USS Resolute broke from formation, her captain executing a maneuver that had not been used since the blockade. Harrison was a grizzled veteran who had served on warships for 30 years, and he remembered the old tactics that the Academy no longer taught. He drove the Resolute directly into the enemy formation, drawing fire from a dozen collective vessels. Warning lights flashed across his bridge as enemy weapons scored hits along his hull, but the old armor held. It had held at. It would hold now. Cut engines, ordered. Rotate on thrusters, fire as we spin. The Resolute went silent and began to turn, her tracking targets as she spun through the enemy fleet. The collective vessels tried to follow, tried to match her erratic movement, but they were too focused on her, too committed to the chase. They crashed into each other, their formations breaking apart as they tried to catch a ship that was flying by rules they did not understand. Old trick, muttered as enemy vessels exploded around him, but it still works. On the USS Constitution, Lieutenant Commander Lisa coordinated the assault from the tactical center. She had studied every battle that these ships had ever fought, every victory and every defeat, every moment of desperation and triumph. She knew what they were capable of. Valiant and Pioneer moved to flank the enemy left, Lisa ordered through the fleet communications channel. Independence and Defiance maintain pressure on the center. Constitution will punch through on the right. The human ships moved as one, responding to commands with the unity of a single organism. They fought like wolves circling a herd of prey, striking where the enemy was weakest, withdrawing when the enemy gathered strength, always moving, always attacking. Deep in the engineering section of the Defiance, Park pushed the ancient reactors beyond their rated limits. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. Warning lights flashed across every panel. But the old girl held together, her systems straining but not breaking, her heart beating with the fury of a warrior who refused to die. She is giving us everything she has, reported to the bridge, every last bit of power. That is all we can ask, replied. The battle raged for hours. Human ships took damage, their hulls by enemy weapons that they could not completely avoid. The Pioneer lost her forward battery. The Independence was bleeding atmosphere from a dozen small breaches. The Valiant had been hit so many times that her outer hull looked like the surface of a moon. But they kept fighting. The Void Collective flagship was a massive vessel called the Consuming Darkness. It was twice the size of any other ship in the enemy fleet, bristling with weapons that could reduce planets to rubble. Its commander had been watching the battle with growing frustration, unable to understand how these primitive human vessels could possibly be causing so much damage. Finally, the Consuming Darkness turned its attention to the Defiance. A dozen weapons locked onto the human flagship, each one capable of destroying her 100 times over. The collective commander wanted to make an example, to show these stubborn primitives what happened to those who dared to challenge superior technology. Torres saw the targeting locks appear on his displays. He knew what was coming. There was no time to dodge, no way to avoid the overwhelming firepower that was about to be unleashed on his ship. "All hands," he said calmly, "brace for impact." The shots never landed. The USS Valiant interposed herself between the Defiance and the enemy flagship. Captain had anticipated the attack, had positioned her damaged ship exactly where it needed to be. She had served with for 15 years. She knew how he thought, and she knew that the fleet could not afford to lose its flagship. "You owe me a drink, Tors." His voice came through the communications channel, strained but filled with the same stubborn defiance that defined every human who served on these ships. The Valiant shuddered under the assault. Her hull breached in 3 places. Atmosphere vented into space. Crew members were thrown against walls and floors as the ship fought to survive the punishment being inflicted upon her. But she held. She held because she was built to hold. She held because her crew would not let her fall. She held because that was what human ships did. "I will buy you the whole bar," promised. The human fleet reformed around the wounded Valiant, protecting their own even as they pressed the attack. They had been fighting for hours. Their ships were damaged. Their crews were exhausted. Their ammunition was running low. But they had not stopped. And as the Void Collective began to realize that these 12 ancient vessels would not break, would not flee, would not surrender, something changed in the mathematics of the battle. Fear was not a factor that appeared in tactical calculations, but it should have been. Because the Void Collective was beginning to understand that they were not fighting machines. They were fighting humanity. And humanity did not know how to quit. The battle ended not with a single moment of triumph, but with a slow realization that spread through both fleets like the first light of dawn. The Void Collective was broken. 200 of their ships drifted as wreckage, torn apart by kinetic weapons that they had never expected to face. Another 50 had fled into fold space, their commanders unwilling to continue a fight that they could not win. The rest hung motionless in the darkness, their crews surrendering rather than face the relentless fury of the human fleet. The consuming darkness, flagship of the collective invasion force, was gone. It had taken the combined firepower of the Defiance, the Resolute, and the Constitution to bring it down, 3 ancient warships concentrating everything they had on a single target until even that mighty vessel could take no more. When it finally exploded, the light was visible from the observation deck of the Coalition station, a brief new star that marked the end of a threat that had seemed unstoppable just hours before. The cost had been high. The USS Pioneer was gone. She had placed herself between a collective cruiser and a crippled dreadnought, absorbing fire meant for a ship that could not defend itself. Her captain, a quiet man named Brooks, had given the order to hold position even as his vessel came apart around him. The last transmission from the Pioneer had been simple: "Get them out. We will hold." They had held until there was nothing left to hold with. The USS Independence was barely alive. Her crew worked desperately to keep life support running, sealing breaches with whatever materials they could find, sharing oxygen tanks as the air grew thin. She would need months of repair work before she could fly again, but she had survived. That was what mattered. The USS Valiant drifted near the Defiance, her hull and broken from the punishment she had taken protecting the flagship. Captain had finally allowed the medical team to treat the wounds she had been ignoring throughout the battle. When Tors came aboard to check on her, she was sitting up in the medical bay with a bandage around her head and a grin on her face. "That drink," said, "you mentioned something about buying me a whole bar." Sat down beside her bed. "I did, and I meant it." "Good," closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with her, "because I plan to hold you to that." On the Coalition station, the atmosphere had changed completely. The alien delegates who had laughed at the human fleet now stood in stunned silence, watching the battered ships limp toward the repair docks. The ambassador had not spoken a word since the battle ended. Daniel Hayes stood at the viewport, looking at his ships. The Defiance was covered in new scars that would join the old ones, marks of another battle survived, another impossible situation overcome. She was not beautiful by any standard that the galaxy used to measure such things. but to Daniel, she was the most magnificent sight he had ever seen. Admiral Karen shuttle docked with the station a few hours after the battle ended. She walked through the corridors slowly, acknowledging the salutes of crew members who had fought under her command. When she reached the observation deck, she found Daniel still standing at the viewport. "Hell of a fight," Karen said quietly. "Yes, Admiral, it was." Karen stood beside him, her old eyes taking in the scene outside. The Coalition fleet was beginning to recover as engineering teams worked to restart quantum cores that had been disabled by the phase disruptors. The elder races would have their magnificent vessels back soon, but they would never forget what had happened here. "The Pioneer," Karen said, "Captain Brooks and his crew. They saved the dreadnought. 300 people survived because of what they did. 300 aliens who laughed at us a week ago." Daniel nodded. "Yes, 300 aliens who will never laugh at us again." Approached them, his crystalline form moving with none of the confidence he had shown in their earlier conversations. He stopped a respectful distance away, his faceted eyes fixed on the human admiral. "We were wrong," said. "We looked at your ships and saw only age and obsolescence. We looked at your technology and saw only primitiveness. We did not understand what we were seeing." Karen turned to face him. "What do you see now?" There was silence for a long moment. "I see ships that should have been destroyed 100 times over but somehow kept flying. I see crews who fought against impossible odds without hesitation. I see a species that built their vessels not to impress others, but to survive anything." "That is what we have always done," Karen said simply. "We have existed for 12,000 years," continued. "We have built civilizations that span galaxies. We have weapons that can destroy stars and ships that sail on beams of pure light. And today, we were saved by vessels that we would have melted down for scrap." Daniel spoke quietly. "Those ships were built by people who did not know what waited for them in the darkness. They only knew that they were going to face it anyway. Every bolt, every plate of armor, every system was put there by humans who wanted to give their children a chance to come home." "Is that what drives your species?" asked. "The desire to come home?" Daniel thought about the scratched message he had once seen on the Defiance, words carved into a wall by someone whose name had been lost to history. "She brought us home." "Partly," Daniel said, "but there is something else. We call it stubbornness. Some people call it foolishness, but it is the reason we survived when other species would have given up. It is the reason we kept fighting today when all logic said we should have fled." "What is this thing, Prest? What do you call it?" Admiral Karen answered. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of generations who had served on the ships now limping toward safety. "We call it hope," she said. "The belief that tomorrow can be better than today. The refusal to accept that any situation is truly hopeless. The knowledge that as long as we keep fighting, we have not lost." She turned back to the viewport, watching her ships. The Defiance, the Resolute, the Constitution, the Valiant and the Independence. The vessels that had been mocked and dismissed and forgotten by a galaxy that measured worth in technological advancement. "Your ships are beautiful," Karen said too. "They are wonders of engineering that our species can barely understand. But beauty fades, technology becomes obsolete. The things that truly last are the things that cannot be measured: courage, determination, the willingness to sacrifice for others." She paused, her eyes finding the spot where the Pioneer had made her final stand. "That is what our relics carry within them. Not just metal and reactors and weapons, but the spirit of everyone who ever served aboard them. The hope of everyone who ever watched them fly away and prayed for their safe return." Was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice held something that Daniel had never heard from before. "Respect. We will remember this day," said. "We will tell stories of the Relic fleet that saved the Coalition when our magnificent vessels could not. and we will never laugh at human ships again." Karen nodded slowly. "See that you do not." The stars burned cold and distant outside the viewport. Somewhere among them, the survivors of the Void Collective were fleeing back to their space, carrying stories of the primitive humans who had defeated them with ancient weapons and impossible courage. Somewhere among them, the legend of the Relic fleet was being born. Daniel Hayes watched his ships make their way home, battered, broken, beautiful. And still flying. Always still flying. That was the human way.